Hello, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you all so much for coming to the first event in our 2021 Wisconsin Book Festival schedule. We are so delighted to have Emily Mandel here in conversation with Chloe Benjamin for Emily's book, The Glass Hotel. It is always delightful for me when we are able to do an event for a paperback because it means so many more people have read it. But that said, not everyone has read it, and I want to make sure everyone knows that we welcome your questions, but we really would love for you to not spoil anything for someone who's still waiting for it from Madison Public Library's hold list. So, and there are those people. So, I want to say welcome to you and say thank you to Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors who have kept the Wisconsin Book Festival alive and vibrant over the last year of pandemic, and who have never wavered in their commitment to bringing free cultural events to all of you across Madison, across Wisconsin, and across the globe. So welcome to all 500 of you who are watching tonight. Thank you for making this such a wonderful kickoff event for 2021. Many of you, I'm sure, know Emily St. John Mandel from her 5 novels that include The Glass Hotel and Station 11, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and a PEN/Faulkner Award winner. She has had a career that has spanned 32 languages. She lives in New York City with her husband and her daughter, who we are told may make an appearance tonight, depending on what the 5-year-old wants to do with her evening. We are also joined by our moderator, Chloe Benjamin, who many of you know from previous Wisconsin Book Festival events, including the kickoff to the 2018 festival schedule with her book, The Immortalists. Chloe is one of the wonderful Madison authors that we get to have come and grace the book festival. She is also a graduate of the University of Wisconsin fiction program, where she got her MFA, and she lives right here. Chloe, Emily, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm going to turn it over to the two of you for a lovely conversation. Thank you so much, and I will see you at the end.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody watching. And thank you to Chloe for doing this. I know it's a
so
huge
my
commitment.
Pleasure. Well, I was going to tell people that way back in 2014, like probably everyone else here, I read Station 11 and I was so blown away that I'm pretty sure I sent you like a raving fan email.
It was really nice. I appreciate it.
Well, you were lovely. And a few years later, we reconnected and we've been able to talk about books and writing after acquiring an audience and how we're working. And I firmly believe that one of the best parts of being an author is meeting the authors that you love. So this is really a treat.
Definitely. Yeah. But one of the other best things about being an author is meeting your audience. So to everybody watching, I wish we could do this in person. It's wonderful we can do this, but hopefully in other years, I'll be able to meet you.
Yes. Well, Emily, would you like to kick us off with a short reading from The Glass Hotel?
I would love to. Let me just move my keyboard out of the way. Okay, let me see here. All right, I'm going to read just for about 3 or 4 minutes from, I think this might be my favorite chapter in this book. This isn't really a spoiler. If you read the back of it, there's a massive Ponzi scheme, a huge financial crime. And this chapter, I'm just going to read a short excerpt. It's from the perspective of the Ponzi scheme staff. So these are people going to work every morning to perpetuate a massive crime. We had crossed a line, that much was obvious, but it was difficult to say later exactly where that line had been. Or perhaps we'd all had different lines or crossed the same line at different times. Simone, the new receptionist, didn't even know the line was there until the day before Alkydis was arrested, which is to say the day of the 2008 holiday party, when Enrico came around to our desks in the late morning and told us that Alkydis wanted us assembled in the 17th floor conference room at 1 o'clock. This had never happened before. The arrangement was something we did, not something we talked about. Alkydis came in at 1:15, sat at the head of the table without making eye contact with anyone, and said, "We have liquidity problems." There was no air in the room. "I've arranged for a loan from the brokerage company," he said. "We'll route it through London and record the wire transfer as income from European trading." There was a knock on the door just then, and Simone came in with the coffee. No one was sure where to look. Simone had only been on the job for 3 weeks and wasn't party to the arrangement, but it was immediately obvious to her that something was amiss. Only Ron returned her smile. Joelle stared blankly at her, as did Alkydis. Oscar was looking very fixedly at the legal pad on the table before him, and it seemed to Simone that there were tears in his eyes. Enrico and Harvey were staring into space. Simone finished pouring the coffee, closed the door, and waited in the corridor instead of walking away. It seemed to her that no one spoke for an unnaturally long time. Look, Alkydis said finally, we all know what we do here. Later, some of us would pretend that we didn't hear this, but Simone's testimony would echo the accounts of several of us who did hear it. Some of us who pretended not to hear it would also pretend not to know there was a line. I'm as much a victim as Mr. Alkaitis's investors, Joelle told a judge who disagreed and sentenced her to 12 years. But then at the far opposite end of the spectrum was Harvey Alexander, who would agree wholeheartedly with Simone's testimony and go on to confess to things he hadn't even been accused of in a kind of ecstasy of guilt. But for those of us who did hear what Alkaitis said in that meeting, those of us who admitted to hearing it, that statement represented the final crossing, or perhaps more accurately, the moment when it was no longer possible to ignore the topography and pretend that the border hadn't already been crossed. Of course, we all knew what we did there. We weren't idiots, except for Ron. Ron glanced around, confused. He often seemed confused. The rest of us had noticed that about him, and it seemed he actually didn't know what we did here, which was baffling in retrospect. What did he think we were doing, if not running a Ponzi scheme? Still, there it was. He looked around in the silence, cleared his throat, and said, well, we have so much trading activity with the London office already, though. The silence that followed this remark was, if possible, even worse than the silence that had preceded it. No trade had ever been executed through the London office because the London office was comprised of a single employee with 5 email addresses, whose job consisted primarily of wiring funds to New York to give the appearance of European trading activity. That's an excellent point, Ron, Harvey said. He spoke kindly and with a certain sadness. That was a short excerpt from chapter 10 of The Glass Hotel.
Emily, I think that might be my favorite chapter of the book. I'm so glad you read from it. That is such a delightful and surreal window into so many minds at once. And I actually have a question for you about that a little bit later, but let's dive in. You have had such an interesting career. I suspect that you often are told, I loved your debut, Station 11, and in fact, Station 11 was your 4th book.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, Emily's first novel, Last Night in Montreal, was published in 2009, and it was followed by The Singer's Gun and the Lola Quartet. All 3 of these, which are excellent, by the way, were published by a smaller independent publisher called Unbridled Books. And then for Station 11, you jumped over to Knopf, which is a part of Penguin Random House. And this is where your latest book has been published as well. I'm curious, when you think about the arc of your career, does it feel somehow twofold to you? Or does that feel like that's just the business part and so it's continuous because it's about the books themselves?
It does feel twofold to me, and I know you had a similar experience with a breakout book, because this is something we've emailed about, which was so interesting. But, sometimes in a career, there's the book that divides your career and by extension, your life into a before and an after. And Station 11 was absolutely that for me. My life was just completely different after that book than it had been before. So, yeah, it does sometimes feel like 2 careers. For my first 3 novels, it was a very small press, and they were so wonderful. I loved working with them. I had a brilliant editor there. Everybody was so dedicated. It's just so difficult for any book to come to your attention, speaking to the audience as readers, without this sort of marketing apparatus that might not always be apparent, but that's how the book often, arrives in front of you. So small presses just don't have that, and it was quite difficult to find an audience. So yeah, so I was an administrative assistant for 12 years, and like retail before that. I've been like a million different jobs. And I was really at peace by the time my third book came out with the idea that that would be my life forever, that, I would always be an administrative assistant, which was fine. I didn't mind the work. I was good at Excel. And, I'd be able to supplement that income by writing these small press books on the side. But then with Station 11, I recognized that I had a somewhat more commercial premise than I had with my first three books. And I really agonized over the decision to switch publishers because Unbridled Books really was great. But I decided I had to just go for it and try it. And my editor at Unbridled was so gracious about it. And I really appreciated it. And yeah, and then Knopf picked it up, and it's had this unbelievable life in the world that I never would have anticipated. It sort of feels like I won the lottery, to be honest. So it's been a very surreal few years of people actually reading my work.
I can imagine that shift is all the more strange after three books. Say for me, it
Yeah.
took place after one, but after three, you're really established in a certain way. And my other question for you was going to be: did you feel in the writing of Station 11 that it was different somehow? And it sounds like you knew it was more commercial.
Mhm.
Did you also have a kind of sense like I think this one might find a larger audience, or there's something I'm keying into that's different here? Or did it just feel as precious to you as the rest of your book children?
Maybe a bit of both. You get better at anything the more you do it. Hopefully. So I've always felt like my second book was better than my first book. My third was better than my second, and so on and so forth. And I did feel writing Station 11 that I was writing a much better book than I'd ever written before, which is obviously really subjective. And I know my French editor completely disagrees and likes my first book the best. So, it's all subjective. But yeah, it did feel different. At the same time, something I was so aware of then and that I'm aware of now is how many absolutely brilliant books just don't find a big readership. There's just such unbelievable luck involved. So, yeah, it did feel different, but it never felt like any kind of a guarantee, if you know what I mean, that more people would read it.
Publishing is fickle, and even books that everybody thinks are going to launch in a wild way sometimes don't, and the reverse can happen as well.
Yeah.
So I know just what you mean. Speaking of the arc of your career, I was so intrigued to see some characters show up in both Station 11 and The Glass Hotel. And I was curious, did you always envision these books as being loosely connected? And if not, when did those characters from Station 11 kind of insist on
Right.
walking into the Glass Hotel?
It's funny. I'm I get attached to characters even if I'm not really attached to the book that they're in.
Mm.
So, by the time anybody reads my book, it's been through a million rounds of edits. I've been agonizing over it for years. And there's this feeling of get this thing off my desk. I'm ready for something new. So I'm not really attached to a book by the time it's published, but sometimes I'll write a character who I just really like. And in Station 11, I found I really enjoyed writing Miranda and Leon, although he has a very small role in Station 11. And also Clark, who I haven't used yet, but I think I will because I really liked him. So I liked the idea of using Miranda again, which created a pretty major logistical problem because I do kill her off in Station 11. And, the book's been out for 6 years. I feel like that's not such a spoiler, but, she dies in the flu pandemic. So I decided that what I needed to do was set up the idea of parallel universes or like alternate worlds, really just so I could use those characters again.
Mm.
So toward the end of Station 11, there's a moment in one of the final post-apocalyptic chapters where a couple of characters, I think it's Kirsten and August, are sitting beside the road in this post-apocalyptic landscape. And they're playing this game that they've clearly been playing for years, where they just kind of riff on variations of reality. Imagine a world where the flu pandemic had never happened, for example. And then I was trying to lay the groundwork of alternate universes. And then I tried to kind of mirror that toward the beginning of the Glass Hotel, where there's a scene where Vincent is just kind of wandering the streets of Manhattan, and she's kind of playing the same game with herself, imagining different permutations of reality. For example, a world where that terrifying flu pandemic hadn't been so swiftly contained. So I was trying to set up that idea of these books kind of existing, not in the same universe, but in parallel universes. And I know it was confusing to a lot of people. I've seen a lot of really nice reviews of The Glass Hotel that are like, but clearly it's set in the years just before the Station 11 flu pandemic. So, if you're thinking of reading The Glass Hotel, the flu isn't coming. It's a 100% pandemic free book.
That's so interesting. It made me think of David Mitchell's books. David Mitchell has a number of different novels, but he has this idea of the Uber novel, in which all of his works are sort of speaking to each other in different
Mhm.
ways. And so that looser association was also what I experienced when reading these. And I did look online. I was like, so one of them, is it a prequel or a sequel? But it,
Right.
it didn't really seem quite that quite that
Yeah,
clear.
it's just super confusing. Yeah, and part of it for me is that in Station 11, you get a lot of Miranda's earlier life where she's married to an actor and lives this somewhat surreal life in Hollywood. You don't get a ton of her professional life after that in the shipping industry. And I was kind of interested in exploring that aspect of her character a little bit further. So, yeah, so in The Glass Hotel, you just see her as a shipping executive and you
Mhm.
never see, the art that she draws, which is a big part of Station 11. So, yeah, it was the same character, but it was also an interesting way to look at completely different aspects of that character's life.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about characters. One of the things that I love about your work and that I see in all of your books is this sense of compassion and detail that you bring to characters. I don't know why I remembered this detail, but in The Glass Hotel, you mentioned that Simone's assistant, Keisha, was a poetry major. Somebody has a line, you're the poetry major.
Mhm.
Or when you write that Harvey, who's one of the characters running this Ponzi scheme, as we heard in the bit that you read, he rises from his desk chair, and the quote is, "With some difficulty, his knees were bothering him." And there's just these little glimpses that let us into the much fuller lives of these characters, fuller than what you can show us because you're limited
Right.
by page space and main characters and so on. But you grant each person this humanity and kind of this fullness of history that's just right behind the page. And I was curious, is this something that you do intentionally, or does this just come naturally to you, this way of seeing people?
Um, Maybe both, but I would, in the context of the book, I would definitely make a distinction between like something coming naturally and something like coming easily, like in the
Mm.
page. Yeah, I always want the characters to seem as real as possible, and I don't always have a clear image in my mind of what they look like. But sometimes I'll have this sort of vague image, like, with Harvey, he's an older guy, he's a little out of shape. I just like thinking about that moment when he's rising from the chair. I just, I think he'd have a little bit of difficulty, like his knees are bothering him, which, everybody's knees start to bother them at some point. Yeah, and then just imagining Keisha, I think at first I just had her dialogue, which I don't think it's quite sarcastic, but there's like a little edge to it. And once I'd written that, I just found myself thinking, now where does that edge come from? And I've known an awful lot of administrative assistants who were, poetry majors or fine art majors or whatever semi-unemployable degree it was they'd gotten, which as the graduate of a program in contemporary dance, I have a ton of sympathy for. So, yeah, it's a lot of it for me is just trying to make these people seem as real as possible.
Well, I do have to say, on the administrative assistant note, that is another similarity that we share. I was an administrative assistant while
Okay.
working on my first book, and it is a great job for a writer. So if there are any writers in the room, I think it's just one of those jobs that you can kind of turn off at the end
Yeah.
of the day, but it's also like meticulous and satisfying and detail oriented. So note about that. But yeah, I think this is what makes your characters feel real to me, that they have this combination of, as in Harvey's character, the ability to do harmful things, but also the same vulnerabilities and, and humanity that we all have.
Well, thank you.
um, so let's talk about Jonathan Alkaitis. He
Yeah.
is the character who is running this Ponzi scheme, and as you said, it is on the jacket, so it's not a true spoiler. I'm curious how you approached his character and the decision of how much to explore why he did what he did with that compassion that we've been talking about. We learned about some of the traumas in Jonathan's life. And one of the most touching to me was reading about his relationship with his first wife, Suzanne, and the contrast between this and his partnership with Vincent. Suzanne is an equal partner to him. And you have this great line on page 230, a difference between life with Suzanne and life with Vincent, one of many. He told Suzanne everything. So when I think back to for instance, the Bernie Madoff situation, I don't recall a lot of compassionate humanization, more a sense of horror and justifiable blame. And yet I think one of the projects of fiction is to offer understanding to characters and to illuminate who they are, no matter how bad their deeds. So how did you find your footing with the character of Jonathan?
He was by far the hardest character to write. Because, yeah, as you alluded to, this even though every character in this novel is fictional, it's not actually about Madoff. That is, of course, the central crime. And so the problem I was faced with in looking at that inspiration, if you can call something that horrible an inspiration, is that while I found the crime fascinating, both in its scale and in the fact that it required a staff, which is mind blowing. There was that chapter I just read. Madoff himself is so profoundly, fundamentally uninteresting to me. If you read interviews with him from prison, he's just such a garden variety sociopath, which, he takes this sort of tone of victimhood. How terrible it is that those investors pushed him for unrealistically high returns. They all should have known. It was kind of on them that they all got cheated. Like, it's really tedious. So I felt like I had to create the character from scratch, even though I had the crime. And trying to create somebody with some nuance who would do such a horrible thing, I found to be a huge challenge. So yeah, I appreciate you saying that there was some humanity there, because I worked so hard on that, over successive drafts. And yeah, I was thinking his first wife, like that relationship, would probably be the main thing that humanizes him. You could make an argument for his relationship with his daughter, but they don't have a great relationship. She's always longing to get his attention, and he's always been distracted by work. But yeah, he was really difficult. I think that villains are the hardest to write, in my experience. And I also think you're right that the project of fiction should be that, we try to see why they're doing what they're doing. But yeah, it was immensely difficult.
And I think, just as villains are hard to write, I think the ones that are most satisfying to read are the ones that disturb us because they feel human, because in some way we can identify. I often mention that in the Harry Potter books, for example, Voldemort has never really interested me, but Snape does.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's that push and pull. So you've read from the Office Chorus, this particular chapter earlier, in which we get to know the people who are working for Jonathan. Not necessarily the masterminds of the scheme, but people who have known about it, except for Ron.
We've all worked with a Ron, let's face it.
We have worked with a Ron, and I just loved you for the way that you wrote Ron. Again, you humanize these people, and there's a particularly wonderful bit of dialogue that I'll read because it asks a question that I would love your thoughts on.
Sure.
Here's the question, Joelle said, and I'd be genuinely interested to hear your thoughts. How did he know we'd do it? Would anyone do something like this given enough money, or is there something special about us? Did he look at me one day and just think, that woman seems conveniently lacking in a moral center, that person seems well suited to participate in and here she's cut off. But I'm curious, in the researching and then the writing of this novel, did you form your own opinion as far as answering that question?
I think we're more susceptible to sliding into that kind of thing than any of us really want to admit. The line in the book, which is actually a quote from Leonard Cohen, who was one of my very favorite singers, is we die for the truth in our secret lives. But in your actual life, where you've got significant financial responsibilities, you're covering mortgages, tuition payments, whatever, and somebody offers you an obscene amount of money, You like to think that you would say no once you realized that it was fraudulent. But what if you'd been working there for a while before you realized it was fraudulent? What if you were able to convince yourself that, say, it was a temporary kind of a Ponzi that, by some financial magic, the Madoffian character would be able to steer it back into legitimacy? Um, if, say, it had been going on for 30 years and, it had kept going, so you could tell yourself with some plausibility that perhaps it could keep going forever. And perhaps it would have in Madoff's case, or at least for a very long time, because the 2008 financial crash was really what brought it down. So, absent that kind of extraordinary event, it could have kept going for really a very long time. Yeah, we like to think that we would never become the office chorus in the Glass
Mhm.
Hotel, but I think more of us are susceptible to that than we'd like to admit. And I think that you don't have to be an entirely terrible person through and through, to find yourself in that position.
Yeah. I think there's this really fascinating moral spectrum in the book. And one of the wonderful things you do, and the thing that again can be uncomfortable to read in its accuracy, is that we all slip and slide along that spectrum
Yeah.
more than we'd like to admit. My next question is about Leon, and there's a moment, I won't give it away, but later in the book where he, who is a character who feels really upstanding and with a strong moral compass, um, he decides to stay silent about something to his
Yeah.
benefit. And um, I just found that such a fascinating move because it asks us to consider whether we should look back at the arc of his character differently because of
Mhm.
that, or whether we see this as the fault of circumstances or the best that he could do.
Yeah.
In many ways, it feels like Leon kind of stands in for the reader. I think most of us see ourselves as a Leon, thoughtful, like I said, a person with a moral compass.
Mhm.
So it's all the more unnerving to see his life fall apart after he and his wife lose their savings. They wind up living in an RV and they're working low income temporary jobs. You described this economic underworld as a shadow country.
Mhm.
And I found myself wondering how you learned about the varied worlds of this book, both the kingdom of money, as you call it, and the shadow country. What kind of research did you do to get a feel for such opposites?
Right. We've kind of glimpsed both just in our day-to-day lives. Like the world of money, which the line in the book is money is its own country, which I believe to be true. It's just a very different, very sort of specialized experience. You know, if you don't meet very wealthy people in your day to day life, you do kind of glimpse how they live these days on Instagram and television and the rest of it. So, for that world, it was just kind of that, people I've met over the years at receptions or whatever, noting the sort of breeziness with which so many of them move through the world, this sort of assumption that no serious harm can come to them. Also, just kind of extrapolating from moments in my own life where to give an example of this, so about 6 months before the pandemic, I went to Los Angeles a couple of times for a TV project I'm involved in. And both times, because I have this crazy number of Delta Air miles from my epic promotional tour for Station 11. Both times I decided to fly back to New York on the red eye and upgrade to first class just so I could sleep that night. So what that experience looks like is you take off from LAX at 10:30 at night. You flatten your bed to 180 degrees, pull up a very comfortable duvet, have a really nice nap, and then, wake up 5 hours later in New York. And I found it a little bit disorienting. There was this feeling when I got off the plane in New York, like, you can't convince me these are two separate cities. Like, it was like the luxury and ease and frictionlessness of the experience rendered the distance kind of hard to believe somehow. And so I saw the kingdom of money as kind of being like that, just taken to a much further degree, where you would just move, over borders, but it wouldn't feel like it, just this sort of frictionless experience. And then the shadow country, I think we try not to notice the shadow country because it's terrifying. That's, the same trips to Los Angeles, the incredible number of tents underneath the expressway, The people who walk up and down my street collecting cans and bottles, to get 5 cents each. The incredible homeless populations in so many cities in this country.
Mhm.
And I think we try not to see those people kind of for the same reason we don't like to think about that moral slippage we were just talking about, which is that this is not a country with a particularly strong social safety net. It's pretty easy to fall through the cracks there. And I think we don't like to see those people because we're afraid that could happen to us. So, yeah, so it was partly just extrapolating from experiences. And then I did do some reading about it. Um, I'm blanking on the name of the author, which is really embarrassing, but there's a book called Nomad Land about this sort of itinerant workforce in the United States, which is enormous. It's like tens of thousands of people, a lot of whom are living like Leon, going, in an RV from warehouse job to warehouse job. Jessica Bruder is the note that just came up in the chat. Thank you, Connor. Appreciate it. Okay, Nomad Land by Jessica Bruder. It's a great book about this topic. So that was really helpful, just in understanding the logistics of that life. And then also, yeah, then I don't think I did any specific reading of books for what it's like to be very wealthy. But I did spend a lot of time on like weird job posting sites for households. As you know, if you're a billionaire, you've got a household staff. So yeah, like reading descriptions of like the house manager position for some estate, like what just to get a sense of like who surrounds you if you have that much money.
You have this great line about how you would think that the experience of wealth is increasingly isolated, but in fact, you're around more and more people because you have so many people sort of taking care of your life.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I can totally see why you would be looking at those jobs.
That's actually that was another. You reminded me of another inspiration for that, which is a good friend of mine has worked for years for a billionaire, and they sign like 1,000 confidentiality agreements. I don't even know who the billionaire is, but yeah, there's a house staff, and the way he describes it is the family is never alone. There are always people kind of hovering around and in and out and taking care of business, and yeah, it is kind of fascinating to me that there's yeah, that you don't automatically get privacy, with that kind of money.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Before we go on, I want to invite the audience to submit questions. Emily and I are going to chat for maybe 5 or 10 more minutes, and then we'd love to hear what you are interested in knowing. So I think you can just enter those in the chat and they will eventually make their way to us. So we are aiming for this to be spoiler free. So I know this might be a slightly challenging question, but I still would love to talk about Vincent's arc. We haven't
Sure.
talked about Vincent yet, and she is in many ways the protagonist of this book. Someone who is a searcher and finds her way into Jonathan's life and shares it briefly, but is continually impacted by kind of the choices that she made that led her there and how she thinks of herself in part. You very cleverly drop us into the book's final moments in the opening pages, but we're still not quite sure what's happening or if something else might happen after this to change her trajectory. I'm curious, did you know all along how you wanted her story to end? And was it difficult to stick to that arc? I know I'm pushing a little
Right.
bit, but I think for folks who have read it, they'll want to know as much as I do.
No, that's fine. I didn't know what the book was for such a long time. This book was so hard to write. And originally it was just going to be very narrowly focused around this Ponzi scheme. Um, it had at least 3 different structures. I kept on rewriting it and rewriting it and rewriting it, partly because my first round of editorial notes could reasonably be summarized as, "Could you please change everything?" It's like, I did. So, in the first version of the book, it was so far from being the book that it became. In the first version of the book, someone else fell off the container ship. Like, this isn't a spoiler, by the way, for anybody watching. She falls off on like page 2. Someone else fell off the container ship, this friend of hers, and she's kind of traumatized and somehow ends up with Jonathan. That was one version. Um, there were other versions where I think she didn't fall off the ship. It just, yeah. So I guess the short answer is no. I had no idea, what this was going to be when I started writing it. And I feel like I made such major edits to this book so many times that it was like I wrote The Glass Hotel 3 times. It really felt like 3 distinct books I put together. And it really wasn't until pretty close to the end that I came up with the structure that I have of, where it starts with this event and then kind of circles all the way back to it. By the end, you get more details and find out how it happened. Yeah, I don't write from an outline, and they're often huge surprises.
Well, nor do I. And it's funny when you were sharing that, it made me remember that one of the things I asked you in that very first email correspondence was like, how did you keep track of the Station 11 structure? And I
Right.
think you told me Excel.
Yeah, yeah. As I mentioned earlier, I was an admin for 12 years, so I have crazy Excel powers.
Flexing those muscles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I had a spreadsheet for Station 11. And with Station 11 too, I didn't have an outline. But then I got to the end of this book with this incredibly complex structure, and I just could not keep it all in my head. I needed some kind of a roadmap. So yeah, my Station 11 Excel map was there was a line for each chapter. And the level of detail for Station 11 would be like chapter 1, intro to Arthur slash no, intro to Jeevan slash Arthur dies on stage. Like that kind of, uh yeah, really like pulled out sort of focus. Yeah, so every chapter had a line. I had there were sections of the book like laid out as sections in the spreadsheet. It was so helpful. It allowed me to find technical problems. There's a character in Station 11 who you spend about the first 3 chapters with, and then in the original draft, he then disappeared for like 200 pages. So, like, that's a problem. You'll have forgotten who that character is. So, having that roadmap was really helpful for that. I didn't really have anything like that for the Glass Hotel. It was, I guess there were fewer elements in some ways. Yeah, it felt a little bit easier from that perspective with the Glass Hotel to kind of figure out where things could go. But at the same time, I kept reordering it, trying to find a structure that worked for literally years.
Well, I think that's so helpful to share, really. I mean, for me as well as everyone else here, it's hard to write a book, and I sometimes get the sense that if you've written a book before, or at least if I've written a book before, I think I should know how to do this by now, right? But I kind of think of it like children. Every child is different.
Mhm.
Even if they're from the same parents, they might need entirely different approaches. And so hearing, that a book that looks seamless to us when reading it is one that really went through a lot of permutations and that, you didn't know your way through at the
Right.
start. I think it's really, really helpful for
Well,
us.
that's good. For me, it's been kind of two-sided, where on the one hand, I definitely have more confidence now when I start a book that whatever the book ultimately turns into, I will have a book, which I definitely didn't have at the beginning. But on the other hand, yeah, I totally see that as like thinking of it in terms of like different children being different. Another way of looking at it is in terms of working at the limits of your talent. Like maybe it shouldn't be easy at
Mhm.
all ever, and I think it's really easy to sort of go too far in that into this kind of punitive, tormented state where you're sort of torturing yourself with your book. But yeah, what got me through the Glass Hotel was through writing it was thinking, well, if it's hard, that must mean I'm trying something harder than I've done before.
I think that is so true. I often feel like sometimes I get frustrated with myself for choosing concepts that are ambitious or that require a lot of research. But I think if there wasn't a sense of risk, I wouldn't be interested for the length of
Yeah.
time it takes to write a book. If you're going to spend 2 to 5 years or more on something, I think maybe we have to be not quite sure that we can
Yeah.
pull it off.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I think that makes you a better writer. You go even further with the book after that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's do one more question before we see what the audience would like
Okay.
to
Sure.
ask. Um, hmm. Okay, I'll let you choose. Do you want to talk about genre or writing after Station 11?
I mean, I kind of want to talk about both. What do you want to talk
Okay, well, let's do both.
about?
Let's do both. Now there's two, so you can divide your
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Okay. No, actually, I'll talk about genre. That's a little bit easier.
Okay.
Something that's become clear to me over the years. I'd be curious to know what your experience is because your work straddles genre too. is just how subjective these labels are. Or,
Yeah.
with my first 3 novels, I thought of them as literary fiction, which is kind of slippery to define, but let's call that fiction with an emphasis on character development and prose style. But in fairness, they did have crimes in the plots, so I was kind of being categorized as a crime writer, with those 3 books. But what was interesting was that in North America, I was a literary fiction writer, but I would go to France, where with the first 3 books, I had a way better career in France than I did in North America. And I would be at all these French crime festivals, like sitting next to the guy who wrote 3 Days of the Condor. It was just this totally different world. So that really brought home to me how subjective these labels are. And then with Station 11, my goal was to write a book that could not possibly be, have make me that could not possibly pigeonhole me as a genre writer, just because I was afraid of being stuck in kind of a marketing box that I couldn't get out of. So now I'm a sci-fi writer, apparently. So, you get labeled in these different ways. The experience I had with Station 11 was, people would come up to me and say, I've heard great things about your book, but I only read literary fiction and your book's sci-fi. So, no offense, I'm not going to pick it up. Other people will come up to me and say, I've heard great things about your book, but I'm really only interested in sci-fi. And, that one was nominated for a National Book Award. So it's obviously literary fiction. It's not really my thing. Like, same book. So, the way I've come to think of it, which I find to be more expansive and generous than thinking of books as being either or, it's just thinking in terms of books being more than one genre. And I really like that idea that, Station 11 is literary fiction and sci-fi, and The Glass Hotel is literary fiction and a mystery. I feel like it's maybe a stretch to call it a thriller, but it's sometimes marketed as such, and that's fine. Yeah, that's the way I've been thinking of it lately.
Well, it's so interesting you say that. I feel the same way, and I was trying to think about sort of what categorizes all of your books to me, or not categorizes so much as sort of what feels like your style, what I sort of expect when I come to your work. And I think it's this kind of juxtaposition of the surreal and the mundane. There's this in this book, especially in the context of crisis. Um, there's this line from the moment when the FBI are ransacking Jonathan's offices. Oscar was playing solitaire on his computer, which had been disconnected from both the internet and the internal network, while investigators went through his filing cabinets. And certainly the kingdom of money is also a place of absurdity. So I feel like when I read your work, I'm not expecting necessarily any genre in
Mhm.
particular, but rather a reading experience that puts the familiar and the unfamiliar side by side, and in doing so, highlights sort of the strangeness that's inherent in real life.
I love that. As writers, we can't see what our work looks like from the outside, and that's really
Mhm.
lovely to hear.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. It would be terrible if you were like, "That's not what I was going for at all."
I was
Um,
going for realism, come on.
yeah, exactly. Well, let's take a look at some of our audience questions.
Sure.
Um, Emily, feel free to let me know if there's any that leap out to you. Um, but this might be fun. Somebody says, "What was the most surprising change made during the editing process for The Glass Hotel?"
Um, I think it was when Vincent became the woman who fell off the ship.
Hmm.
Because for at least 2 drafts, it was a friend of hers. And it and I kinda meant that as something that sort of set up Vincent psychologically for running off with this guy with money, which is kind of a crazy thing to do. You have to make a few mental leaps for that to be reasonable. But I'm thinking, well, she's been through this trauma. She's a little bit unmoored. That was her best friend in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And it just wasn't really working. And then I felt kind of sad when I realized it had to be Vincent, but it had to be Vincent. So
Mm,
I think that was the most surprising change.
mm. Somebody else asks, "How does the writing or the creative process change when you move to being a full-time writer?"
You know, I feel like there's always something that gets in the way of writing, which isn't even strictly negative. Um, One of my very favorite novels of the last few years is Department of Speculation by Jenny Ofel. And she has this wonderful riff. The protagonist in the book is a writer. This wonderful riff about this woman kind of thinking about how when she was young, she was going to be an art monster, is a phrase, and as an example of an art monster would be Nabokov, who, I don't know if this is true, but she says in the book, he didn't even fold his own umbrellas or lick his own stamps. His wife was there to take care of absolutely everything, so he could just write. And that's the kind of idea that I think when you're very young, you think, God, that's an amazing, uncompromised artistic life to just write. But then as you get a little older, that can start to feel really limited. Like, really, that's your whole life? There's
Mm.
no other aspect of human experience beyond sitting alone in a room writing novels? Like, that sounds awful. So,
Yeah.
when I had a day job, writing was a matter of it was really hard because I was always struggling to balance the writing with a day job. But then after I quit my job, I was on this epic tour, and then 2 months after the tour finished, I gave birth to my daughter. So, that's not something that speeds up your writing process or gives you more time to write.
Yeah.
So, it used to be that I was juggling a job with writing. Now I'm juggling parenthood with writing. And it's not even a matter of not having enough time to write. It's a matter of not even wanting to spend too much time writing, so I don't miss too much of the experience I have with her.
Mm.
So, yeah, I kind of feel like it's always something. Like, even when you're a quote unquote full-time writer, which, by the way, is an amazing position to be in, and I'm so profoundly grateful and never thought it would happen to me. Yeah, I do still find very similar pressures to what
Yeah.
I had when I had a day job.
That's interesting. I I certainly think that the same is true for me, and also you have the pressure of this being your only job.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
coping with
I
the
know. I know.
psychological
It's
presence of
yeah.
that is a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. And I'll get questions like what inspires you to write when you're just not feeling it? It pays my mortgage. Like, that inspires me. It's
Uh-huh.
like, yeah, having payments I need to make.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is a whole different pressure.
Yeah. Um, oh, this is interesting. So somebody says, I would love to hear about the appearance of ghosts in the book and any connection with that idea of parallel worlds.
Yeah, there's an interesting connection there. So when I first started writing the book, the ghosts were a pretty small part of the story. And I don't feel like this is a huge spoiler because, again, if you've read the back of the book, there's a Ponzi scheme. I don't think it's a huge spoiler to say that that criminal goes to prison. So when Jonathan's in prison, after a number of years, he begins seeing the ghosts of investors who committed suicide after they lost everything. And I liked the idea in the first few drafts of that being kind of ambiguous. You're not actually sure if he's seen real ghosts, if you can use the word real in connection to a ghost, if they're just projections of guilt, if he's losing his mind a little bit, year after year in this prison. But then as I was writing the book, I just found myself more and more interested in the idea of ghosts and what it means to write a ghost story.
Mm.
Because it seems to me that when we use that phrase, ghost story, we tend to think of it in these kind of narrow classical terms, like, the spectral figure wafting down the corridor, like that kind of thing. But what if your life is haunted by the ghosts of the lives you didn't lead? That's an idea that fascinates me, that comes up in that same section where Jonathan's in prison. That's your counter life, your counterfactual life, the life where you went to a different school or married a different person or emigrated instead of staying or vice versa. And in so doing, completely altered the trajectory of your life. So I love that idea. And that seems to me to be a different kind of haunting.
Mm.
And then, consider the way that we're all kind of haunted by the things we wish we'd said or wish we hadn't said or wish we'd done or wish we hadn't done. And that's very much Vincent's situation. Also the situation of the Ponzi staffers. They're all a little haunted by guilt or culpability or yeah, or roads not taken. So it just became really interesting to me the more I revised and refined the book and tried to think of ways to pull the themes together in a hopefully somewhat coherent way, that the book would be about hauntedness in some ways. So just thinking of different kinds of ghost stories.
Yeah. Oh, I love that idea. Um, Someone else has asked, says both of your books feature strong relationships among siblings. Do you use or draw from anything in your own families?
I do. Yeah. I'm the second of five. I have an older half sibling. And, I'm pleased to say I have a much better relationship with her than, Paul and Vincent have with each other. But that I guess that has set me on a path of thinking a lot about family dynamics and about the bonds between siblings. They're just really interesting relationships. Um, I just and it's funny, the relationships that change so much over the course of your life. Like, I definitely had moments when I was a little kid of wishing I was an only child. But now in adulthood, like nobody's more important to me, than my family. And yeah, so I guess they're just relationships that are really interesting to me.
I often talk about the combination of intimacy and distance that I think a lot of us feel with our siblings. There can be this, obviously an incredible sense of history. You know them better than anyone, but also depending on how close you are with your siblings in adulthood, you might not know who their best friends are or what the
Yeah,
movie was that
exactly.
they saw. You lose often that day-to-day texture, especially if you don't live in the same place anymore. So I think they are really interesting relationships, especially as they move into adulthood.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see. What made you choose Vincent for the name of the main character? Does the poem have particular significance for you?
I wonder what poem they're alluding to.
Maybe
Probably.
the poet?
Oh, right. Yeah. So partly just that I love the name Vincent. Um, and also, not long before I started reading The Glass Hotel, I'd read a really great biography of Edna St. Vincent Millay, the American poet. It's called Savage Beauty. It's a really good book. And I hadn't known anything about her life, but I just found it to be a really interesting story. Particularly this detail from when she was really young. She was someone who catapulted her way out of this sort of grinding New England poverty when she was 17, really by sheer force of will. And that's something I really respect. And it also seemed to me to be kind of an interesting parallel with this character I was thinking about for this new book. That it's a very different kind of act that catapults her from one life into another. But it is one of those sheer force of will situations. So I liked the idea of echoing that a little bit.
Yeah. And Vincent, speaking of hauntings and lives not lived, she lives so many lives in the
Yeah,
course of this book. And
absolutely. Yeah, which that's something else I respect is the capacity for reinvention.
yes, indeed. Let's see. I missed any of them? We have one question about last night in Montreal.
Okay.
Someone is interested in an allusion to Lolita.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of an unsettling illusion given the plot of the book. Okay, and Last Night in Montreal, which comparatively few people have read because, again, small press, although it was republished by Vintage a few years ago. So there's a character, Lilia, who's abducted by a non custodial parent and spends her childhood traveling around the US. The allusion to Lolita, I just had to reread this book like 2 weeks ago for a different project I'm working on. So I actually remember this. Yeah, there's an allusion in there. It's something like she had 3 or 4 unevenly spaced freckles on her nose, like Lolita. Um, to be honest, I think that was kind of ill-considered of me. I'd recently read Lolita when I wrote Last Night in Montreal. I started writing it when I was 23. It's a little bit of a time capsule. I don't think I would put that in now, but I put it in then. I was just kind of thinking of a physical descriptor, but yeah, there's so many things you do in your first book that you probably wouldn't do in your second, third, fourth, or fifth, and that's definitely one of them. I didn't mean to make any kind of serious comparison between the two characters.
Well, as a very discerning reader, I didn't realize it was just the one sentence. So,
Right.
so that was a very
Well,
specific question.
it's also the name, which I really hadn't thought of. I'd seen this movie set in the 19th century with a character named Lilia, and I just thought it was a beautiful name. And it honestly didn't occur to me until I read the first scathing review of Last Night in Montreal that the name could be seen as like some kind of, the name itself could be seen as an allusion to Lolita, given the similarities.
Interesting. Sometimes, you just don't know until you read reviews, like where the overlap or lack thereof
Yeah.
between what you intended and
I know. It's often quite far.
Yes. Well, we have just a couple minutes left, but it sounds like the question that was asked the most was people hoping to hear who are some writers that we're both enjoying reading at the moment. Would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I've been reading. So we were emailing about this. In fact, I have one of his books right here, Propping Up a Lamp. Let me see if I can do this. Okay. I've been reading a lot of, I apologize if I mispronounce this. I think it's Xixin Liu. This sci-fi trilogy, The Three Body Problem, The Dark Forest, and then I think Death's End is the third. I've really been enjoying it. What have you been reading lately?
Well, I read an anthology of Chinese science fiction writers that you recommended to me.
Oh, Broken Stars?
Yes. Well,
that is so good. I love it.
And I got it from the Madison Public Library, so we can shout them out as well.
Excellent.
And I'm also reading Life After Life at the moment, which I feel
I love that book. It's so good.
I keep getting that reaction, which is, exactly what you want to hear. And I confess I started it years ago. And I think the very early chapters, there's a bit of a sense of like only reaching the first level of a video game and then having to go back to the first level. And so I think that for some reason, I couldn't get into it. But this time, once you get past that, for me at least, it's so absorbing. And I have had many people say, oh, I wish I could have the experience of reading that again for the first time.
Well, that reminds me of another favorite book of mine. What is it called? The writer is Jenny Erpenbeck. She's a German writer. The End of Days. It has kind of a similar moving through time repeatedly sort of vibe to it. But yeah, anybody watching this who loved Life After Life, The End of Days is great.
Interesting. Well, since none of us can travel right now, why don't we end with this last question? What do you miss most about traveling for author appearances? And maybe I would add, what do you miss least?
The thing I miss least is being away from my family. It's possible to be extremely grateful for extraordinary circumstances, which an author tour absolutely is. It's amazing to get to tour. And simultaneously really miss your kid. So I spent a lot of time away from my daughter when she was quite little, or sometimes I'd bring her along, which isn't easier. That was a whole other set of logistical challenges. So I don't miss being away from my family. I had dinner with my family tonight and then came down to my office for this, and that feels so special. What I miss the most is just going places. I live in Brooklyn. I've got a really great view of Manhattan from my terrace. I haven't been to Manhattan in a year. Everywhere is just so far. And some of the places I got to go were places that hadn't necessarily been on my list for travel, but they turned out to be just so amazing. Like, I got to go to South Dakota, to Spearfish, South Dakota for a lecture, probably about 6 months or something before the pandemic. And it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. And I never would have got to see it if not for book travel. Can I ask the same question of you?
Oh, of course. Gosh, what do I miss most? I think certainly the travel, also the in-person connection.
Definitely.
I think we're all learning just how much we miss being in the presence of other people. And even though it is wonderful to be able to do so many things virtually, and there's this incredible democratization, we're so happy to have, I think, almost 500 of you with us tonight, which is
amazing
and could never happen in one bookstore. But I miss like sitting in a theater, watching a play, like just that sense of presence in the air. What do I not miss? Touring, you and I've talked about this, it is grueling. And I think, it's glamorous in many ways and feels like this sort of old publishing fairy tale, but
Mhm.
it's hard on the body, you know.
Yeah.
It's really it's kind of an athletic event. So there are things that are easier about just being on my
Yeah,
couch.
definitely. It's also, touring is such a weird combination of glamorous and not glamorous.
Yes.
Like, you'll have the most like glamorous, lovely evening, and then you go back to your hotel and the hotel restaurant's closed and you haven't had dinner yet and it's 10 p.m. and dinner is like a bag of almonds at 10:30.
You're like
It's
cheese
just like-
and a granola
yeah,
bar.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, there's a lot of that kind of around
Yeah.
the margins of the glamour.
Well, and I will say you have a great essay about the experience of touring for Station 11, and I'm forgetting now where it was published. Could you tell folks where they can
Yeah.
look that up?
Yeah, sure. It was Humanities Magazine. It was a few years ago, but yeah, if you Google my name, and the title of the essay was The Year of Numbered Rooms.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's so wonderfully, and again, I think there's this combination of the surreal and the mundane in that very essay.
right.
Well, I want to just say a huge thank you to all of you who have joined us tonight and for your wonderful questions, to the Madison Public Library Foundation, the Wisconsin Book Fest, and Connor Moran, and especially to you, Emily, for spending this time with us and being so open and transparent about your process. It was such a pleasure to talk with you tonight.
Well, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure for me too. And thank you for doing this. It's a ton of preparation to interview an author, and I really
Well,
appreciate it.
I will say, in some ways, it's more nerve-wracking than doing your own events because it's like, I don't want to mess things up for you.
Right. Oh, it's way more nerve-wracking. I almost never interview authors because it's really hard. Yeah. And thank you all to everybody watching. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Connor.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I'm just here to keep the lights on. This was a lovely conversation. Chloe, thank you so much for moderating. It's always lovely to have you. Emily, you have an open invitation to come here and see us, and we promise it won't be almonds and Cheez-Its. Maybe Chloe will even join you for dinner.
I would love that.
Once you can.
amazing.
I want to say thank you to everyone watching at home. I also want to mention that tomorrow night we have our first Wisconsin Wednesdays in partnership with the UW program in creative writing, featuring Dontiel Moniz for her debut Milk Blood Heat and Lady Hubbard for The Rib King. That's at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. We also have about 18, I think 20 at this point, events coming up between now and May 19th. So please check wisconsinbookfestival.org for all of that. Something for literally everyone. I've tried to cast as wide a net as possible this spring. Again, thank you so much to both of you. This has been a lovely conversation. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see all of you again at another Wisconsin Book Festival event soon. Thank you so much, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.